Welcome to part 5 of the PayFi series, where we're trying to understand PayFi as an emergent vertical in the blockchain industry. In the previous part 4, I diverged briefly from the planned trajectory by discussing Stripe as a use case platform onboarding stablecoin providers. It's now time to return to the core theme, focusing on the incumbent blockchains and the competitive landscape that is beginning to emerge. Now, I sometimes think of the PayFi landscape as a kind of digital railway system. That is one which calls for an infrastructure inversion that allows the old finance rails to run on top of blockchain, rather than blockchain trying to adapt and overlay itself on top of the old system. This notion and the nature of infrastructure inversion was something that was popularized in the early days of Bitcoin. Needless to say that Bitcoin has not yet delivered. Perhaps it sounds complicated, but it can be easily understood via analogies. If we take cars, when they arrived, there were no paved roads, but rather dirt trails suitable for horses. Cars continuously got stuck in mud, and there weren't any gas stations. The car was although such a revolutionary technology that it only took a decade or so before the dirt roads were paved and the necessary supporting infrastructure with gas stations had been established. That essentially completed the inversion, going from cars driving on roads built for horses to horses riding on roads built for cars. Similarly, the telecom providers resisted voice over IP services such as Skype and banned it initially. However, within the span of, I believe, a decade or so, voice calls had moved from copper lines to fiber cables, and the telecom providers eventually also accepted applications like Skype and later WhatsApp because they had refined their core business from one being on revenue generation via voice running through copper to revenue generation via data running through fiber optic cables. Returning to the issue at hand, we can look at DeFi, which we have discussed in previous parts. DeFi has not presented enough real-world linkages, and its delivered utility has been too crypto-native to motivate an infrastructure inversion of finance. It has therefore failed in bringing traditional finance on-chain. This is where PayFi comes into the picture. With its more attractive rails that bring real-world utility, it naturally attracts, embraces, and integrates traditional finance, initially as single use cases, but eventually as an engine that tokenizes finance, completing the former failed infrastructure inversion, as all of traditional finance eventually will run entirely on blockchain in roughly a decade from now. I talked in an earlier episode about PayFi being poised to eventually onboard virtually the entire global settlement market. And once you understand the all-encompassing dynamics of how infrastructure inversions work, then you will also grasp and see the inevitability that I referenced. I also mentioned how technology is deterministic. I referenced the modern smartphone form factor with touchscreens as something that those with deep insights into the last decades of technological development knew was inevitable due to improvements in components and the convergence of technologies, along with dropping costs, putting touchscreen smartphones at a price point where it had mass market appeal. Similarly, we can approach the PayFi vertical with rational logic and identify the competitive dimensions that will determine who gets to dominate the space, just like Apple did with the iPhone. Recall how I said initially to think of PayFi as an emergent digital railway system. The tracks are being laid down, but with every blockchain still trying to lead by building its own version of the infrastructure, such as the tracks, the stations, and the border control. A convergence of standards and methodologies will have to materialize around what becomes the primary infrastructure before a full-scale inversion of traditional finance and settlement can occur. Those primary infrastructure components will also be what constitutes the competitive dimensions, just like touchscreens, processors and batteries, among other things, were competitive dimensions for the first touchscreen smartphone manufacturers. If we continue to look at PayFi as the railway network of the future, we must characterize it as a system designed to carry digital value instead of passengers or cargo. The funny thing is that the success of any railway system depends not on one factor alone, but a precise interplay of 4 foundational elements, each corresponding perfectly to similar foundational infrastructure elements in the future PayFi arena. Firstly, scalability and speed. If your train network does not have the correct tracks and efficient locomotives, your railway system will break down under pressure. This is the infrastructure of PayFi, what Solana excels at. Throughput, latency, cost per transaction, these are the tracks and the trains. You can't run a continental system on a narrow local setup. Secondly, compliance and identity. In the old world, a train ride across borders required customs, passport checks and verifiable tickets. The same goes for PayFi. You need to know who's transacting, not necessarily broadcast it on-chain, but have an ability to prove and disclose it when needed. This is Concordium's domain, a built-in customs and ID system enabling privacy with accountability. You can't scale internationally without it. Thirdly, developer tooling and ecosystem maturity. A railway is only useful if there are stations, schedules and services that makes it accessible to people and goods. In PayFi, this is your SDKs, grants, integrations, documentation, your entire developer ecosystem. Solana has busy terminals, constant arrivals and departures, others are still laying the floor tiles. Fourth, integration with real-world finance. No great rail system exists in isolation. It needs connections to airports, shipping ports and highways. These are the bridges to TradFi, APIs to banks, fintech corridors and merchant adoption. Stellar and in a slower but more deliberate fashion, Concordium are working on these links. Without them, your railway ends in a field. So when we evaluate blockchains in PayFi, we shouldn't ask who has the fastest train. We must ask who is building the best approximation of the entire system, or in a nutshell, who wins on most of the dimensions, as excelling in one aspect isn't enough. Because it's not speed alone, it's the integration of infrastructure, identity, ecosystem and external connectivity that determines who will carry the future of finance on the PayFi blockchain rails.
It's a good idea to get a common understanding on what PayFi is. So PayFi as a term is not new. The term PayFi is as old as many other TradFi terms. It's payment finance. But within the context of blockchain, the term PayFi is new. It was first brought onto the scene. Crypto is at the stage of MS-DOS prior to Windows arriving and becoming the operating system that made computers more viable for many to use. E05 has had limited to virtually no fiat integration. And the reason for that is that DeFi has not natively focused on compliance. It has not natively included regulatory aspects and ID and these kind of things. So that creates ambiguity, and it is definitely not something that TradFi institutions can touch. And that means that DeFi naturally back in 2021 became, let's say, echo chamber for Web3. And it didn't, as it didn't cross the chasm to legacy finance or Web2, it lacked real world use cases. And so it became more and more entrenched and more circular in crypto. And that is because PayFi is going to encompass the entire concept of tokenization, real world asset tokenization. And I actually have a lot of thoughts on that as well, because my nuance on the definition of a stablecoin is broadening. And I think that as long as you have tokenization of real world assets that are truly fungible or approximately fungible, then the distinction between what is relevant to tokenize and what is relevant to build as a PLT, so as a stablecoin, but a stablecoin stable not in fiat terms, but in a real world asset term, could be a commodity, could be basically anything, could be a crypto asset, so say a Bitcoin stablecoin, not a stablecoin backed by Bitcoin, but a stablecoin stable in Bitcoin terms, thereby of course backed by Bitcoin. But yeah, again, the distinction, it's not a fiat stablecoin. I have a growing understanding of the fact that Concordium has opened the door to something truly unique with PLTs, and that the notion of what other blockchains call tokenization on Concordium has another dimension to it. Anyway, again, this is a cliffhanger, and I'm sorry, this will be something that I will touch upon once I handle the first cliffhanger I explained, which is that I believe PayFi will take longer to come of age than what we could hope for, which does not mean that it's not going to be a massive value builder. Stripe is a centralized player. While they enable blockchain adoption, and while they solve some of the problems that I'm going to point to later on, Stripe is still a single point of failure, and it is going against the peer-to-peer nature of blockchain. Ultimately, the vision for PayFi, for those that are true crypto natives, must be to enable peer-to-peer without middlemen interactions with merchants. This hasn't been possible in the past due to the complicated nature of payment processing. When you make a credit card transaction, what goes on? It's madness. It's dinosaur procedures in a modern era, and its time is outdated. But the inefficiency in the market is what has allowed the rise of neobanks, of payment processing companies like Stripe. Obviously, in a very competitive market, it's an anomaly that you have so many neobanks and progressive banks that are rising, and that has to do with the market inefficiencies. If they were not present, there wouldn't be a basis for them to rise to their tremendous size and valuations that they have. Stripe is a prime example of that. So with blockchain, we are eliminating the inefficiencies, and we are empowering on a peer-to-peer basis merchants to interact directly with their customers. And that is why I believe that Stripe and others, they will play a role. They will form things. They are something to consider, but actually in the long term, I'm not afraid of these kind of players.